The following is a simplified explanation of the current North Korean nuclear crisis threatening the United States and their allies, recreated in the Warcraft universe. Liberties have been taken with names and places, and while the actual events may not correspond with Warcraft lore, all allusions seen here are accurate to real-world events currently taking place. Imagine for a moment Grom Hellscream became war chief at 40 years of age. He ruled Orgrimmar for 20 years until he was slain by Manaroth, and the brash young 28-year-old son of Grom, Garrosh Hellscream, took over leadership of Orgrimmar. Now, Orgrimmar is a failed state, yet somehow still managing to scrape by on the bare resources it has. The people themselves are starving. They're a land of warriors, but they have no healers, no mage tables. The only way they can regenerate health is to wait out of combat for a while, which isn't very efficient nor supportive to morale. Technologically, they're in the vanilla WoW era. While those in Stormwind or Pandaria have access to the internet and dungeon finders, Orgrimmar and the people serving under Garrosh Hellscream have to operate on a complex network of LAN servers, click-to-move functions, and hour-long Hearthstone cooldowns. The defensive systems are even more ancient, like the user interface for Warcraft Orcs and Humans in a pixel resolution of 800 by 600. Orgrimmar is a very totalitarian society, a lockdown low population server that nobody wants to play on. Propaganda keeps the people in line. It tells them over and over that their country, their land, is superior to all others. They are elite. They have a 1,000,000-man army called the Corcoran, which they prove on the forums via screenshots quite frequently. Anyone who speaks out against the war chief or his army is locked away in concentration camps. In Orgrimmar, they believe in guilt by association, so even if your alt tune or your girlfriend's Draenei says Garrosh is a douche nozzle, you and everyone you know could be locked up forever. The current numbers count 200,000 subscribers currently imprisoned for speaking out against their dictator. And now to the other side of the coin, you have Stormwind. They've been an established world superpower since the Burning Legion invasion on Kalimdor during the events of Warcraft 3, in which Archimonde tried to establish communism and burn down a tree, until a conglomerate of humans, orcs, and night elves stopped him and instead enforced their capitalism. This victory earned Stormwind many cross-realm allies. Since then, Stormwind has continued to extend their reach, and it's their belief that Orgrimmar would benefit from an alliance invasion because the Corcoran have been brainwashed by propaganda, though they wouldn't dare make a move against a 1,000,000-man army, at least not without expecting an absurdly high amount of casualties. In essence, the army itself is a deterrent for invasion, and thus everything's fine. So here is where things get interesting. Recently you might have heard Orgrimmar publishing anti-Stormwind propaganda. Garrosh himself visits the front lines and warns his soldiers to prepare for war. Threats are made. Orgrimmar will launch a series of nuclear attacks on Stormwind using the same mana bombs that decimated Theramore at the end of World War II. Aside from his 1,000,000-man army, Garrosh also has quite a few airships and siege weapons at his disposal, though admittedly the tech used is laughable when compared to Stormwind's cutting-edge weaponry. They'd be used more for defense than attack. But why declare war on one of the world's biggest superpowers? Do they even have a chance? Are these threats legitimate or a growl at the sky? In order for us to understand Hellscream's motives, we have to look at the situation from his perspective. When Ashenvale was attacked by the Horde at 9/11, the Stormwind retaliated by invading the Southern Barrens and burning Camp Torojo to the ground because they might have weapons of mass destruction, which of course turned out to be false. But in reality, all they went there for is the Tauren supply of oil and maybe a satchel of helpful goods. But it wasn't just for this, it's because Camp Torojo wasn't their ally, and Stormwind didn't like that.
If you're not with me, then you're my enemy.
Even if Camp Torojo ended up being innocent, it didn't matter because Stormwind had rendered them harmless through a convenient excuse. Garrosh Hellscream saw this and realized that he may also soon be the victim of a convenient excuse. Maybe the 1,000,000-man army wasn't enough of a passive deterrent. Now let's talk about allies for a second. Orgrimmar has diddly squat in terms of support. Their long-term ally is Yara, who have a large number of citizens occupying Orgrimmar, would not side with them in a war due to the socio-economic devastation it would unleash on their recently stabilized country, nor would Azshara side with Stormwind. Just as Northrend, they would stay out of the fight completely unless a full-blown war were to take place and they had to defend themselves naturally. Durotar is an ally of Stormwind and the Eastern Kingdoms, and therefore an enemy of Orgrimmar. So if war were to break out, they'd be among the first victims, though a nuclear attack would seem unlikely as this would hurt Orgrimmar in the process, not to mention the non-combat zones separating the two areas from combat since Beta WoW. But Garrosh and the Corcoran are scared. 30,000 Alliance soldiers gather in Durotar along with Vol'jin, 4,000 and an early warning missile system in the Northern Barrens, and 6,000 troops on the Lost Isles with a base primed for bombing runs. They've seen the Alliance go unpunished for their crimes in Torozho, they know they're on the same hit list. Combine this with the recent death of their leader Grom Hellscream, the new young war chief trying to prove himself to the military leaders under his command, and you've got the recipe for rapid escalation. Even the goblins of Azshara who support Garrosh are saying to him, dude, tone things down with the nukes, it's not cool. It's the global equivalent of being backed into a corner, and as we all know, this leads to desperation of which we could all pay the consequences. As for the nuclear threat, perhaps one of the biggest questions you might ask is, does Garrosh have the ability to carry out his threat? Am I safe? Could his mana bombs reach us here in the Eastern Kingdoms? The short answer is, probably not, but things aren't that simple. Attacking an ally of the Eastern Kingdoms is the same as attacking the Eastern Kingdoms themselves. If Garrosh were to use nuclear warheads on the targets, he can actually reach with his equipment, say Durotar, Northern Barrens, the Lost Isles, or Northern Pandaria. The allied response would be swift and merciless. The worst thing that could happen is Garrosh launches nukes against all targets, and the Eastern Kingdoms responds with nukes themselves. This throws deterrence out the window, and suddenly everyone is launching mana bombs of opportunity against all their enemies, which will completely upset, if not obliterate, the balance of power on Azeroth. An armed alliance invasion would succeed much better, but then it becomes a question of preemptive strikes, which is a dangerous train of thought to ride. And even if Orgrimmar finds a way to launch nukes all the way to the Eastern Kingdoms, would Stormwind's barely tested missile defense system be able to stop more than one warhead at the same time? I for one hope we never find out. But let's end this video on a positive note. Like with the Cuban or Tanarus missile crisis of vanilla WoW, this whole thing will hopefully be resolved via diplomacy. You get Garrosh and Varian to sit down at a table together and discuss the possibility of peace. This requires everyone at the negotiating table to have no hidden motives, for every side to be reasonable and to understand one another. If Stormwind truly intends to overthrow Orgrimmar and repeat the crimes at Camp Torozho, then no amount of negotiating will resolve that issue. If Garrosh is just hell-bent on seeing the Eastern Kingdoms burn, then either Garrosh must be taken out of office or war will inevitably come to pass. But at the end of the day, sane people don't want war. They want loot and a new expansion.